Well, I don't know if you can hear the fireworks outside, but it is officially 2024 as of a few minutes ago. So hopefully those fireworks are not actually being heard, so it doesn't affect your enjoyment of this video. But welcome to Liam's Lyceum. I'm your host, Liam, aka Hembar. Today I wanted to go over my top 10, might be a little bit more than 10, books of the year. I read about 170 almost. And I had to wait till the end of the year to record this just in case. I read 4 books today, or finished 4 books today. So we'll see what my top 10 looks like. But first, I wanted to go through a little bit of just kind of like awards to books I feel like are worth mentioning. But since I just read so many, they're just like their chances of getting in the top 10 are just really rather slim. And then just other things that I enjoyed this year. So first off, for example, is the best movie. My favorite movie this year. Well, first off, in second place is To Live, which is a 1994 Chinese film. It kind of showcases this couple's um, rise and fall over like a course of a life, right? Of becoming poor, the Great Leap Forward, Civil War and stuff like that in China, and a very enjoyable film. But my favorite film this year is probably Dungeons and Dragons: Honor Among Thieves. I'm a huge Forgotten Realms fan, and this very much reminded me of playing things like Dungeons and Dragons with friends, with my brothers and stuff. And it's a very good film. It does Forgotten Realms good justice, and it does D&D, I feel like, some good justice. So very much enjoyable. It's also the first film my daughters are really into that's live action. They've been into like the CGI cartoon type stuff before, but not live action. But they really like Honor Among Thieves for some reason. So I like it too. My favorite TV series is easily going to be Merlin, the BBC Merlin 2008 2012. This has probably been the case for since like 2017. That's probably been my favorite TV series, and it still hasn't changed. I watched it again for the 5th time this year. So definitely my favorite. It's just a great family-friendly retelling of the Arthurian myth. My favorite video game is kind of hard to pick because the game I probably played the most is Halo Infinite, but it makes me a little too anxious like half the time I play. And so my favorite, I'm kind of going to go with this. In the first half of the year, it was EverQuest. Played a lot of EverQuest earlier this year, especially when Oakwind, the server, launched. Uh, and EverQuest is a MMO from 1999, but it's very immersive. It's very, very fun. Like I remember earlier this year with my barbarian shaman going around Everfrost Peaks and like the wandering mob just coming, and we weren't paying attention, and it just we had to run back to Hallis. That stuff like that's fun. And then Lotro as well, though, in the later half of the year, Lord of the Rings Online. I've been playing with my brother lately. In fact, I played it tonight. Uh, and this is a fun, very faithful to Tolkien's work. I mean, of course, it expands because you have to make a very big game out of it, right? But it's very faithful. Not super high fantasy. That people aren't riding around with ridiculous looking armor and like riding on dragons or anything like that. Uh, Very fun game. In fact, this is the first time I played it a lot, but the first time I like really played it was 2012, and that's when I made my character named Hemvar, who I thought that sounded like a dwarf name, and that's where my name Hemvar from online is stuck, kind of. So yeah, I got it from Lord of the Rings Online when I was making my character. My favorite video I've made is probably, I'm not going to judge everyone on BookTube because it's just too much. You'll make some great videos, but I can't judge everyone. But my favorite video, there's a couple worth mentioning, but The King of Speculative Fiction on Fritz Leiber, just recommending his science fiction, fantasy, and horror, is one of my favorites. It came out a couple months ago. It doesn't have as many views as I would like, but hopefully it's a good resource to mention some of Leiber's stuff that's worthwhile. The other ones I enjoyed were my philology ones, particularly the Little of What Tolkien Knew, which is a presentation I gave to the Humanities Society at the local university. Um, and that's actually doing better than I thought it would. And then another one on romantic nationalism, which is more of a video essay in a sense, except for just me sitting there talking, if people like watching that. But that was also in philology, so I enjoyed that one. The best short story, I read tons of short stories. They're not included for the most part in that 160 books. So it's really hard to determine which one is the best because I've just read so many that are worthwhile. But if you want to know more about the short stories I read, you can just watch my weekly updates because I'll mention them there since I don't review them. But my favorite short story this year is probably Coming Attraction. by Fritz Leiber. Surprise! And this is a story from 1950 or 1951. It's one of those 2 years, and it's very much proto-cyberpunk in a sense. It's kind of dystopian. Right after World War III, at some point, a British man is visiting New York for business, and he's just kind of looking as an outsider on American society. And at the time, American society is rather weird. For example, at the beginning, he saves this young woman who's wearing a mask because most women wear masks for whatever reasons. It's like makeup, they say, kind of. He pulls her back because this car drives by that has hooks on it, and it has hooks to rip off skirts, right? And so, like, and there's like electronic music. There's a bunch of wrestling that you can seem to watch anywhere, even in a cab. Um, and then there's microwaved food, which is 1950s. Microwaves are not in homes yet. So, but yeah. Anyways, very, very fun. I very much enjoyed that story, Coming Attraction. Wherever you can find that. You can probably find it online. You can probably find it on YouTube, someone reading it. But the best poem, this is a little hard to choose. I read a lot of poetry. So I'm going to go over a lot that really like stood out to me and mention them, but then at the very end here, just real quick, I'll mention my favorite and why you should read it. So the Old English Phoenix is very fun. It's about almost 700 lines. The ending makes it really cool because the ending is very expertly done, medieval Latin and Old English, and it works really well. To Howard Phillips Lovecraft by Clark Ashton Smith is like a eulogy to Lovecraft once he died. Very, very touching poem. Very impressive. Clark Ashton Smith, probably my favorite poet, maybe easily my favorite speculative fiction poet, probably my favorite poet. And then Swan Song by George Sterling, who is Clark Ashton Smith's like mentor of sorts. Swan Song is exactly what it sounds like. It's a swan song. It's his last poem he wrote right before he committed suicide. Very touching poem. I found myself going back to look at it a few times. At the Makeshift Aid Station by Toge Sankichi is in the aftermath of Hiroshima. Very disturbing, also very touching. The Man He Killed by Thomas Hardy reminds me of, it basically has the same themes as Black Company, if you were to read that by Glenn Cook, and it's a great poem. Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, of course, which is fantastic. Ancient empires, ruins, stuff like that. You can kind of get a vibe of that sometimes when you're reading Malazan or just epic fantasy in general, but it's really well done. And then We Are Seven, which I think is by William Wordsworth, if I'm remembering correctly. Very touching kind of look at families. And then At Last by Elizabeth Eleanor Siddall. I shared 3 poems this year in a row by her. If you look for 3 weeks of poems by her, those are all amazing. And then When Man First Strode by Fritz Leiber is another one I quite enjoyed, and that's an interesting look at kind of a man via evolution, less with God, but yeah, it's a very interesting one. So, but my favorite, the best poem of the year easily is The Hashish Eater by Clark Ashton Smith, and that is also called The Apocalypse of Evil. It's the longest poem I've ever read on my channel. It took me about 25 minutes. I read it very quickly too. So it is amazing. It is essentially the poem that is responsible for the founding of the Lovecraft Circle because H.P. Lovecraft read it in like 1922. It came out in 1920, I believe. And he read it and he was so impressed he wrote Clark Ashton Smith a letter. And a lot of that Lovecraft Circle, not all of it, but a lot of it, important members were really Clark Ashton Smith's correspondents that then became associated with Lovecraft. And it's mind-blowing poem. You should read it. Like, it's The Hashish Eater. You can go find it online for free. Just look at The Hashish Eater by Clark Ashton Smith. So the best medieval work, again, the stories I read this year so up for as contenders are Le Morte d'Arthur by Thomas Mallory, Gregory the Great's Pastoral Care or Pastoral Rule, The Rule of St. Benedict, King Horn, William and the Werewolf, Pierce Plowman, Sir Gawain and the Carol of Carlisle, and The Song of Roland. I reread Beowulf and Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, but those are rereads. So, but I'm actually going to go with The Green Knight, not Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Just The Green Knight. It is a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, so it's kind of cheating, but it doesn't use it's not the same dialect of English, and it's not the same form. It doesn't use alliteration, for example. Much easier to read, actually, the dialect. So The Green Knight but tells the story of the Green Knight, and it's a little truncated too. So very much enjoyed the Green Knight, though, or Green Knight, so Greene Knight. So, and then the best early modern work, because I felt like mentioning it here, is Simplicius Simplicissimus by Hans Christoffel von Grimmelshausen, which is a German novel. It's about the 30 Years' War. It's a picaresque novel. It's hilarious. It's touching. It is very endearing. A very fun novel. You should go and read it. And it's got a funny name, Simplicius Simplicissimus. The best Gothic novel I read is one I actually have right here. The Castle of Otranto, the very first Gothic novel by Horace Walpole. Came out in 1764, I believe, and it's very short. It imitates medieval stuff, I think, very well and a lot, and it blends that with horror elements, supernatural horror elements, and I think it works very well. The best romantic story I read was Undine by Friedrich de la Motte Fouquet, German man with a French name. Happens sometimes. Undine, very good. This is very rather short. It's a novella, and it's about an undine, and so it's very romantic. Kind of has some scary elements to it, but also at the same time is romantic in a different sense, if that makes sense. So the best early fantasy. So again, the ones I'm pulling from, which I included some early horror in this too. So the Automatic Pistol by Fritz Leiber is up. The Shadow over Innsmouth. The Wood Beyond the World by William Morris. Mother of Toads by Clark Ashton Smith. Of course, The Shadow over Innsmouth is by Lovecraft, by the way. Phantastes by George MacDonald. A Witch Shall Be Born. Red Nails and the Hour of the Dragon, all by Robert E. Howard. And I'm going to go with The Wood Beyond the World. William Morris is just great. Anytime I read William Morris, I have a good time, and they're not very long normally. They're all in the public domain too. And honestly, everyone I mentioned could have won. Those are all great stories, all of them. So go and feel free to read those early fantasy stories if you want. But The Word Beyond the World, William Morris is a big influence on Tolkien, so maybe that's why I like him. Best early sci-fi, we have Sinister Barrier by Eric Frank Russell, Triplanetary by E. Doc Smith, War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells, Chambleau by C.L. Moore, Black Destroyer by A.E. Van Vogt. I'm thinking early as in like pre-World War II, by the way. And A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court by Mark Twain. I might have gone with that one. I finished that earlier today, but in some ways, it's like a proto-science fiction. It's kind of anachronistic to call it science fiction, and it's very much, I would say, fits more into like a later Arthuriana than anything. And so I'm going to go with Chambleau by C.L. Moore, which I think is the first or one of the first Northwest Smith stories, which is kind of an inspiration for Han Solo. And C.L. Moore, she's a great author. I believe Farnsworth Wright, the editor for Weird Tales, said that was the best story ever published in Weird Tales. Chambleau, you can go and listen to it on YouTube, the author reading it when she was rather old. But Chambleau, it is a retelling of the Greek myth of Medusa, a sci-fi retelling. Very good. The best anthology or collection that I finished, since I read a lot from collections and anthologies, I don't finish a lot of them very quickly though. But the best one I finished is Realms of Valor, edited by James Lauder. I think this is actually the first Realms of for the Forgotten Realms, and it just has some fun stories in here. It's got Christy Golden's like vampire one. It's got one about halflings from Douglas Niles. It's got Elminster at the Mage Fair, which is classic Ed Greenwood's Elminster stuff. You got Elaine Cunningham, David Cook, Scott Cianson, Mark Anthony, James Lauder, Gene Rogg, Troy Denning, R.A. Salvatore, of course, and very, very entertaining, in my opinion. I like Forgotten Realms. The best YA novel. This has a caveat on it, but I read Residue by Steve Diamond earlier this year. But the caveat is that the characters are in high school. Well, this novel, I read it in August, and it got re-released in September, and I didn't realize it was getting re-released. The covers now look more like this. This is the second book, but if you get the Residue now, it'll look more like this Parasite cover. And I don't know if you can call it YA anymore because the main characters are now college age. They've been aged up. For the most part, the story hasn't really changed. So that's my favorite YA novel I read. Sure, I don't read a lot of YA these days. My best middle grade novel, which probably was published as something like a juvenile, but I'll call it middle grade. And that's Hengist's Tale, or Hengist, if you want to say it that way. But Hengist's Tale by Jill Patton Walsh. Cool to note is her maiden name is Bliss, because she's the daughter of Alan Bliss, who is Tolkien's publisher, or editor at least, or something like that. And she was tutored by Tolkien. So she's kind of a part of this Tolkien circle, if you will, as opposed to the Lovecraft circle. And if you read Tolkien's story that's published after he died, Finn and Hengist, which is not much of an actual story. That kind of figures out the mysterious episode of the Finnsburg episode in Beowulf, or the Finnsburg fragment as well, Old English stuff going on. And it makes sense of that with Hengist and Finn and stuff like that. And he explains it where it makes sense in Finn and Hengist, but it's not really a story. And so she makes it a story, and one that younger readers can enjoy as well. And it's really well done. It's very short. It's just kind of hard to find a copy of it, is all. And then the best academic book, before we get into my top 10, I realize we're 60 minutes in, but we're going to get to my top 10 in just a second. We're going to go with Beowulf, translation and commentary. The translation by Tom Shippey, commentary by Leonard Neidorff. Very enjoyable, but my favorite one last year is probably Shippey's Beowulf in the North Before the Vikings. So this year, surprisingly, it's another Tom Shippey book, though this time it's from Uppsala Books, which is like this new press that does Tom Shippey stuff, plus some other academic work, of course. But very, very good translation, and the commentary is very worthwhile. It's very up to date. It's great. It's like basically Kleber's, but with more, right? Because it has the Old English text and the translation, and by like more, right? Like Kleber's latest one doesn't include jarring and Drought's emendation of line 6a, Errol to Erla rather than Erelos. And that's a worthwhile note, in my opinion. So very good academic book if you like stuff like that. You should check it out. If you haven't read Beowulf, maybe check that one out too. So, and it has been mentioned actually that this has so much, the commentary, the Old English text, the translation, that you could teach the class on Beowulf with this book alone. You wouldn't need another one. Okay, so now we're getting to my top 10. So I want to make, this is going to have historical fiction, it's going to have sci-fi, it's going to have fantasy. You can guess now whether you think my number one read of the years is fantasy, sci-fi, or historical fiction. But yeah, let's get right into it. So to mix you up at the very start, at number 11, I have Implied Spaces by Walter John Williams. This has been described to me as sword and singularity, and that works rather well, though it has a slightly abrupt ending and it's very short. It starts off very cool. It starts off as kind of feels like sword and sorcery, but there's something interesting going on. And what is that interesting thing? Well, the sun seems to be at noon all the time. Now, while not as cool as a setting maybe as Larry Niven's idea of an Alderson disc where it's twilight all the time, which would feel more appropriately sword and sorcery, it's still very cool. Has a lot of big ideas with genes in particular and with these superstructures. But interestingly enough, it's still basically all set in our solar system. So it's not even like super far in the future, all things considered. So very good book. I enjoyed it a lot. At number 10 is a book I don't have physically yet, which is a mistake. I should have it. And I should have at least grabbed the first book in the series. But the second book in the series, in my number 10 spot, is Between Princesses and Other Jobs by DJ Butler, which are his Indrajit and Fix stories, which are kind of an homage to Liber and Vance a little bit. It's like kind of far future duo fantasy, though it doesn't feel super fantastic at times. It's funny. It's about these Indrajit and Fix, and they're jobbers, and they work doing different things, essentially. And Indrajit is a bard, so he doesn't know how to read because he has to retain his good memory, and he knows the insanely long Blotchi, which is his race of man, epic, right? And he's trying to find recital thing to replace him, essentially, because he's the recital thing for his Blotchi people. And so there's like thousands of race, like 1,000 sub races of man, basically from some ancient gene war, essentially, to be honest. But it mostly reads like fantasy, of course. And this one has some cool stuff like aliens. And these are stories that they're published in anthologies. And I go out of my way to get those anthologies just to read the Indrajit and Fix stories in them by DJ Butler. DJ Butler is an insanely underrated author. Like, I don't talk about him a ton as far as reviews go on my channel, and that's because I've already read all his stuff. And that's not true. I read his stuff when it comes out and I review it on my channel. But like his bigger books, like Witchy Eye, for example, I haven't reviewed it because I read it before I started my channel, and that is something you should read as well. So just look up DJ Butler and read his books. At 9.9, I have The Rising Storm, which is a story of the Weaving Void by T.W. Anderson. This is a self-pub book that actually came out in December, but I had read it earlier in the year and the year before that because it was serialized. And it's very fun homage to Dragonlance and the Forgotten Realms. But the thing with Anderson is, and what makes him one of my favorite authors, even though he hasn't released a ton of novels, in fact, technically this is only his second novel, um, is his character work and his like imagery and the way he's able to immerse you into a world. Uh, it's very, very well done, and I'm a big fan. And I reviewed this one recently as well. So, at number 9, the third book in a row that I do not have physically, but that is Snow Crash by wow. How am I blanking on who wrote Snow Crash? Sorry, guys. I'm Neil Stevenson. All right. This book just starts with a bang. Well, it doesn't end with like the most satisfying way, I guess. Like it just kind of maybe goes a little long. It's still a very great read. I enjoyed it a lot more than Neuromancer personally. But Snow Crash starts with pizza delivery basically in a Batmobile and samurai swords. Like, and it's awesome. Okay, it's super awesome. It's very absurd, and it has the metaverse, which is exactly essentially what it sounds like. But that's essentially where the idea comes from. It's this like cyberspace that people are living in and interacting in. That's kind of like a video game type of thing. And then at 8.5, we have The Sword of Rionen by Lee Brackett. Lee Brackett, of course, of Star Wars fame. If you don't know what I'm talking about, look it up. She is a great author, very underrated for some reason. No one talks about her on BookTube. Y'all should be ashamed. This book is awesome because it's told in like an Edgar Rice Burroughs sort of fashion. It's Sword and Planet, by the way, sci-fi. It starts on the future in Mars, and this Earthling then goes back in time to a million years in the past. When there's still seas on Mars. It's also called the Sea Kings of Mars, by the way. That's another name for it. And it's very bittersweet ending. It is Lee Brackett has this like very easy prose, very easy to read, but it's very evocative, very easy to get through, but just evokes all these great emotions, sets these great scenes and these characters, and the ending is just bittersweet. And it's so impressive. I read another book by Lee Brackett I'll mention later. As an honorable mention. But yeah, very good. Lee Brackett's amazing. Speaking of, that book came out in 1949, by the way. Another old one is at our number 8 spot. That is Farnham Bishop and Arthur Gilchrist Brodeurs, In the Grip of the Minotaur. This review, I did a review for this. It has like no views because no one knows what it is apparently, and they don't care. But this is essentially, well, we know the Minoan civilization fell in about 1400 BC. What made it fall? Well, obviously it was Vikings, right? Which is totally bogus, couldn't happen, doesn't make any sense. But it starts by these Vikings rolling in. I mean, in some ways, it actually does make sense, right? The amber trade from the Baltic, the Nordic Bronze Age culture at a time was the richest in Europe. They didn't write anything down though, so who cares? And so they roll into where? Troy. No other than Troy, legendary Troy. And then from there they go to Crete. Of course, fantastic adventures. Very, very gripping. The action's fun. It's not fantastic, really like fantasy, fantastic at all though. Very much historical, very fun. I enjoyed this one a lot, and I really like Broder. He's become one of my favorite authors this year, along with some other authors I'll mention later. But he co-wrote a lot with Farnham Bishop, though apparently Scotland tells me after Bishop died he stopped writing fiction. But I've also read some of this stuff that he wrote by himself, and I have more that I'm planning on reading as well. So great historical adventure. This came out in like probably the 1920s, if I were to guess. So, and then at 7.7, because I'm just screwing with you with these numbers, is Road Marks by Roger Zelazny. The reason I put this one up here is because I could have easily put the last two, or books 4 and 5 of the Amber, because I read those this year as well, like The Hand of Oberon and Courts of Chaos. Road Marks is just a standalone, and that's nice. And so if you want to try something by Zelazny, and maybe his odd sci-fi Buddhism stuff doesn't sound super interesting, Road Marks is great, maybe one of the best blendings of fantasy and sci-fi I ever read. There's dragons, obviously, but there's also his road. It's kind of like the inverted theater of A Spear Cuts Through Water. It travels through space and time, hence the sign Last Exit to Babylon. Very fun. It's full of chapters 1 and 2. It's literally 1 and 2. I think it starts with 2 as well. It starts with chapter 2, and 2 are random encounters that are out of order, and then 1 is like an actual narrative. basically, of what's going on. And there's like this AI that look like books, and it's weird stuff going on. Very worthwhile, very fun. Road Marks. You should check it out. I reviewed it recently. Um, and then at number 7, we have Tower of Silence by Larry Correia. This is book 4 in the saga of the Forgotten Warrior. It's got some cool art in the back because they don't allow cool art in the front anymore. But this is the latest one. It came out in 2023. I read all these books in like a week. Okay, and this was the best one in the series. It starts with Saga of the Black Sword, or sorry, Son of the Black Sword, and Saga of the Forgotten Warrior is the name of the series. And I recently reviewed that one actually. But Tower of Silence is very fun, and it's got themes of like law and morality and stuff like that, but it's probably the first book I've read in a really long time that's just been a page turner in action, and it's like it doesn't make me think a lot, but it's very entertaining. Okay, and Tower of Silence definitely hits that. And I'm not huge in epic fantasy. I haven't been for a while. If you watch my channel, you should know that. But this is epic fantasy that really rocks, and that might be in part because our main character Ashik Kadal, who is very law-abiding, but what happens when he's forced into something that is inherently unlawful is very Conan-esque in sorts. So, and he comes more into that in this one. And this book is just awesome. It's got some cool magic. Definitely, it's got some sci-fi elements in it as well. It's probably in the far future. It's like a lost colony thing, if I were to guess. But, anyways, that's my number 7 spot. At number 6.9, I have Beyond Rejection by Justin Leiber. This was a surprising read. It's the second book I've read by Justin Leiber, who's the son of the one and only Fritz Leiber, of course, even though there's another guy named Fritz Leiber, and that's his dad. But this is a sci-fi book about a man who dies under mysterious circumstances, and when he wakes up, the new body they have for him is a woman's body with a prehensile tail. It's definitely a story about gender dysphoria, but also just like forging your own identity. It almost plays on the trope of like it was all a dream, but it does so expertly. It's very impressive. I found this a very well done novel. It's very philosophical. Plays on ideas of functionalism in particular, and that's not surprising because Justin Leiber was a philosopher. So he passed away a few years ago. But this is first in a trilogy technically, but very much a standalone novel. I haven't read the other books. So Beyond Rejection by Justin Leiber, just a really fun novel about, narratives and stories and how we make like ourselves essentially. So I really, really enjoyed that one. That was one of the biggest surprises of the year, probably. And no one knows it because who pays attention? Anyways, Gentleman of the Road by Michael Chabon is number 6.3. This is a love letter to Fritz Leiber, surprise. And it's about a duo, right? In the Caucasus Mountains around 950 AD, two wandering adventurers live by their wits as tricksters and swords for hire. Until, following a bloody coup in the Jewish kingdom of the Khazars, they get dragooned into a fugitive prince's campaign to reclaim his throne. This exhilarating tale of daring deeds, passion, and friendship, Michael Chabon breathes fresh life and winning humor into the fables of old and delivers an irresistible novel. Very short, has an interesting style. The Jews are the main characters, hence Gentlemen of the Road, basically bandits. But it does involve some Viking stuff, which is very cool, East Vikings in particular. And it also looks at treatment of women in the Middle Ages. We look at, a lot of times we have this image of Middle Ages, it's glorious and manly and chivalric. Wasn't so for women in a lot of cases. So very much worth your time. At 6, solid 6, no points, anything, is Fritz Leiber's The Green Millennium. I could have put some other books on here by Leiber that I read this year, like The Wanderer, or Night of the Long Knives, or Ship of Shadows, which are all great. And most of those won Hugo Awards. So you should go and read those. This one did not win a Hugo Award. The Green Millennium came out in 1953. And it kind of reminded me of Cyberpunk 2. I think it's set in the same world as Coming Attraction, or it wouldn't surprise me. It seems maybe a little bit further in the future. It's a weird story about a man waking up and there's a cat in his house and it's green. And he follows this cat and he goes on weird adventures. And there's aliens and government conspiracies and gangsters. And it's just very entertaining. It's just very entertaining. I didn't have any idea what to expect when I read this. So again, another surprise. And Leiber is just just wild, and it just makes you think, and he entertains, and it's like, wow, that's crazy, man, you're crazy. So yeah, Green Millennium. It's also got this awesome cover, which is like vaguely related to the story. Not really. No one rides a big cat like that, by the way, but the lady's kind of important in the story. So, and then we have at number 5 the booktube can rejoice because it's something you can probably recognize. That's Steven Erickson's House of Chains, who's made this list for the last 2 years. But I'm still reading Malazan. That's one of my big goals in 2024 is to finish Malazan Book of the Fall. But I read House of Chains, Midnight Tides, The Bone Hunters, and Reaper's Gale this year. In fact, I probably could have grabbed any of those. So I just grabbed House of Chains. My favorite is probably even The Bone Hunters, not even House of Chains. I'm a big fan of Karsa. But otherwise, anyways, very fun. Like I said, I probably could have grabbed The Bone Hunters because that novel is able to entertain very well, but also to make you think really well. But House of Chains is also a really good one. Just Malazan in general, that's basically what this spot is for. That's number 5. By the way, there's no more weird decimals going down. They're just 4, 3, 2, 1. So House of Chains, just Malazan, right? Steven Erickson, very much worth my time. I'm looking forward to finishing it soon. But again, I mean, I'm glad to be reading it, and even though it's taken a while. And then number 4, he was actually the number 1 spot. If anyone watched this, has been watching my top 10s for a while, he was number 1 spot for the last 2 years in a row. But he's not number 1 anymore. He's just number 4. And it's because I finished Book of the New Sun, and I read Book of the Long Sun. I read 3 of the 4 volumes this year, and I started Book of the Short Sun. But they don't outdo The Fifth Head of Cerberus for me, which is the first sci-fi I read early this year, so it's an early read in the year. It's 3 novellas. They are wild. The first one is probably the most straightforward. The middle one is like almost impossible, I feel like, to comprehend, maybe. And then the last one's really odd too. But just such a wild, very, very, very thought-provoking. I was taking philosophy class when I was reading this, and I think they went really well in the idea of that. Are these, in some way, the idea is that maybe think of are these aliens human because they perform the function of human, right? So very, very thought-provoking. What is the Fifth Head of Cerberus? Maybe you haven't figured it out, but I'm sure you can. So anyways, very entertaining. Gene Wolfe, I think that's like probably the book that put him on the map, if I'm remembering correctly. That's pretty early Gene Wolfe. And then at number 3, dun dun dun, we have Beneath the Web by Lynn Abbey. This is book 2 in a duology called the Wallensohr books, or duology. The first book is The Wooden Sword. And I read both of these this year. I like Lynn Abbey. She doesn't get like any attention on book 2, and so I'm here to save the day for my buddy Karth. But Beneath the Web was one of the biggest surprises of the year. I was thoroughly entertained by this book. It is just wild. I mean, I didn't expect The Wooden Sword to be so good, because it's like almost like a coming of age. But then it doesn't turn out the way you would expect it to, right? I mean, like in this case, it's like everyone is a victim, essentially. Everyone has trauma, and it's kind of about how you treat that and how the poor are treated in reality. The nobility treat the poor poorly, regardless, right? And it's about love. The action itself is very gripping, in my opinion. But then there's also ideas of family, like you can't choose your mothers in particular. And one of our main characters is this young girl named Barika, but there's also these other characters that come more into play, especially in the second novel. But again, yeah, it's just a story of abuse, especially against women. I feel like not even just less so the poor, more so against women, and just how even as Barika is our main character and it's her coming of age, she gets sidetracked, and it's about the princes, right? Because they're more important, obviously, even though they're not. So I found it a very, very, very gripping novel, and I was very surprised by it. And then at number 2, we're getting there, guys, is Howard Andrew Jones, Lord of a Shattered Land, which is book 1, sorry, in his Hanovar Chronicles. I have read book 2, which also came out this year, which is City of Marble and Blood. I think I liked Lord of a Shattered Land a little more. It's epic fantasy size, very much sword and sorcery-esque. It is episodic in nature. He's described it kind of like as a season of television, the last chapter being the climax of the season, essentially, but told in short stories, essentially. That's what the chapters are. They're just their own short stories, which works really well for reading it. It's also very gripping, but it also has its overall plot as well. It's not quite Monster of the Week, though it has some elements of that because it's sword and sorcery, and you get these cool sword and sorcery monsters. If I liked mushrooms, I don't think I'd eat mushrooms after reading this book, guys. But it's very gripping. And essentially, the idea of it is you take a revenge plot and you flip it on its head, and it's not quite a revenge plot because it's Lord of a Shattered Land, right? His land has been shattered. His city, his people have been destroyed. Okay, his country no longer exists. Those that survive, and that's not a lot, are sold into slavery. So what is his goal? It's not to get revenge, right? This is it's a quest of love, essentially. It's to free his people, give them a life out of slavery. It's inspired by history. It's kind of as if what if Hannibal survived, because our main character Hannivar is kind of Hannibal-esque. His people, the Volani, are essentially the Carthaginians, and the Dervins are essentially the Romans. And I mean, there's some things mixed around. For example, it's an empire rather than a republic at the time, but very, very, very good. Worth your time. I read this one very quickly. It's very gripping. Lord of Shattered Land. I don't think anyone watching this would really be disappointed if you had read this, because it should please epic fantasy fans and sword and sorcery fans. Okay, before I get to number one, I wanted to mention some honorable mentions. I realize this video is really long, but some ones that are worth mentioning that I just couldn't not mention, even though they didn't make the list, was A Discourse in Steel by Paul S. Kemp, a great sword and sorcery novel. Rhymer by Gregory Frost, a great telling of Thomas the Rhymer. The Way of a Dawn by Philip Chase, which is a great opening to a trilogy. I haven't finished the trilogy yet, sadly. Brotherhood of the Wolf by David Farland, which is book 2 in the Rune Lords, my favorite in that series, and very epic. The Pellucid Witch by G. Owen Wares, which is a very cool Dying Earth, kind of in Clark Ashton Smith vein, sword and sorcery story. Kill Switch by Joel Shepard. I didn't read any of his Spiral Wars books this year because I don't think any came out, or else that probably would have made my top 10 list. But Kill Switch is his third Cassandra Crescent novel, which is basically Ghost of the Shell, kind of, in a way, post-cyberpunk, though. And Kill Switch is very fun, and probably the best plotted of the other of those novels. Then Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep by Philip K. Dick, my first Dick. Very, very good. Very enjoyable. It has a very specific tone to it, of this paranoia and stuff. And then there's Three Hearts and Three Lions by Paul Anderson. My third Paul Anderson, probably my favorites. I've also read Tau Zero and The Broken Sword. Black Amazon of Mars by Lee Brackett, which I mentioned earlier. Black Amazon of Mars seems definitely inspired by C.L. Moore's Religiouari. C.L. Moore, another author I mentioned earlier. And it's very good. It's, of course, Sword and Plan takes place on Mars. Long Ships by Franz G. Bankston, I think is his name. A very good classic adventure story from the 1940s, I believe. I can't remember who translated it. The intro that I have is by Michael Chabon. Not a very popular historical fiction novel, but a very good one. It definitely looks at lots of interesting things, and it does it with a very even eye, right? You have this Jewish character that is not just a big trope. You have Muslim characters that are not, the bad guys, essentially, in Spain at this time. And so it's very well done. You even go to England. I think it's the Battle of Malden, maybe. I can't remember exactly. But you see some cool stuff. And then there's Gorel and the Potbelly God, which is Guns and Sorcery by Lavi Tidar. And Circumference of the World, which is kind of a fun genre literary retelling of L. Ron Hubbard's religion type of thing. It mentions a lot of sci-fi authors from like New Wave and stuff like that. So, and then you also have Twilight of the Gods by Scott Odin, which is a very good second entry in his Grimnir series, which is The Redemption of the Orc. And then you have The Dragons of Empire by Christopher Rocchio, which is the novella about Lorien and Aristides for the Sun Eater fans. I enjoyed that a lot. Consider Phoebus by Ian M. Banks, the first of the culture books, apparently the worst, according to everyone, but I think it is a very fun book on identity, and it's just some fun adventure, and it's very gross at times and very interesting. It got a lot. It's all over the place, but I liked it. And then there's Black Rain by Masuji Abuse, which I finished today, but I knew it's very sublime. It's about the bombing of Hiroshima, if you can tell. And it blends this horrible events with this is a kind of enjoyment, of nature. There's a flower on a rock, there's a shrine on a hill, there's eels in the stream, um, and sublime, just sublime. And then Servants 4 by Larry Correia and Steve Diamond, who I mentioned both of those authors earlier. But Servants 4 is book one in a series that is kind of fantasy, but like World War I fantasy. And it has mechs, which is cool. And then Serpent Mage by Margaret Weiss and Tracy Hickman. I just finished the Deathgate cycle, and book 4, Serpent Mage, is my favorite. It's got this cool world of water, essentially. And then there's just so many more that I can't mention. I read too much. Unfortunately, I can't mention them all. This video is already insanely long. But my number one read for the year, it's actually no surprise because I've been very open about it. If you just asked me, I would have told you, and I've mentioned in other videos, and you've seen it on Discord probably. But that's going to be Central Station by Lavi Tidar, who I just mentioned a couple of his and for honorable mentions. And this is a big surprise for me. I wanted to read it just because I wanted to read more by Lavi Tidar, and it's very short. And I was like, okay, yeah, that sounds good, right? I guess World Fantasy Award winner. I don't know if that's the author of the book itself. I didn't even look it up, but it has a quote on here by Alistair Reynolds, who you may be more familiar with because Tidar is for some reason not very well known. Beautiful, original, a shimmering tapestry of connections and images. This is a story that is a fix-up novel, but don't worry about that because I'm not going to explain what that is right now because this novel is just amazing. Okay, it is very literary and genre bending. It is cyberpunk, but it's got vampires. It's got elements that I would call magical realism, if nothing else. It's got AI, like robots. And it also has themes on family and themes on what it means to be human. Very specifically, that is explored a lot. And it is beautifully done. And if you have not read Lavi Tidar, you should probably be reading this, okay? Fantastic. Okay, everyone needs to read Lavi Tidar, and Central Station may be the one for you because this is my favorite book of the year. Okay, phenomenal. I can't say much else about it. Okay, and then of course at number 0 is The Lord of the Rings, which I did reread this year, so that's just a gag. I have to number 0. It's always The Lord of the Rings. But anyways, those are my my top 10. Not really. I didn't count how much that actually was, but I put it in 10, right? Except for it wasn't because I went to 11, I guess, too. And then some of my favorites from earlier, the first 16 minutes. So hopefully you enjoyed this video. I know it's too long, but I had fun making it. It's nice to be able to look back on the year and mention some of the books I was able to read. I love reading just good books, wherever it's from, whatever time period it's from, whatever genre it is. Heck, throw the word genre out the door and I'll just read it. And hopefully if you enjoyed some of these books as well, and if you haven't enjoyed them, hopefully you will enjoy them, especially if you haven't heard of them before. Maybe you can go read them. Take my word for it. Okay, they're worth your time. So anyways, thanks for watching. It was a good year. I know this will be coming out in 2024, but still, it's a good year. So I will catch you next time.